Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2.
Chapter 11. Ahsoka mentioned that none of you were conscripted. I would assume that could have been said for most of the fallen at Trunion? Rex asked soothingly, ensuring his eyes were fully engaged with the two troopers before him, his hands resting on his kneecaps as he remained seated upon a grouping of rocks. Conda was the first to utter a sound. A deranged giggle escaped his lips before he could suppress the instinct. The same could be said for most of the Imperial Army, sir. Bren's cordial nod agreed with the assessment. Astride Rex, Callus remained unmoving, his hands folded into the arms of the brown robes he adorned, his face unchanged since the troopers had arrived. "Look, you'll get the same answer from everyone I know. How about you, B?" Conda said, giving the female trooper a gentle nudge with his elbow. "Same for me, sirs. I've never met a script myself." She paused with her head tilted to the side. "You're a clone, aren't you?" she asked in a light tone. Inwardly, Rex wanted to roll his eyes, knowing full well where this conversation would go if they didn't come to the point quickly. "It is irrelevant. There are many here from all walks of life, trooper." Callus spoke up, while shaking his head free of the hood, his accent rife with outer rim infusion. Long blonde hair spilled forth, framing his sharp features and neatly groomed beard. "The three of you have a choice," he continued, eyeing them all in turn. He waited briefly to see if there was any recognition within their gazes. Neither Conda nor Bren recognized him. The third, Tovich, he reminded himself, was seated on the rocks a few meters from them, facing the canyon wall opposite them, rocking back and forth with increasing recklessness. Rex noted the man's odd behavior and stood up. Placing a hand on Callus's shoulder, he nodded toward Tovich, the two understanding each other without a word spoken. Rex strolled toward the increasingly frantic man, stooping to his knees as he reached him and placing an arm around his shoulders to settle his actions down before he hurt himself. "It'll be all right, trooper." Tovich slowed, but couldn't bring his body to a complete rest. Rex looked him over, noting the shredded black bodysuit at the man's abdomen, the few bits of tarnished armor that clung to his left ankle and knee. It was the man's face that troubled him most. Finger-length hair had been torn out to the scalp in broad patches, long lesions left in its place, and the little hair that remained fell disheveled in chaotic patterns with no trace of its original color, with the streaks of dried blood taking prominence. The man's eyes looked hauntingly straight through Rex when he tried to get Tovich to concentrate his focus. A milky white residue congealing across the retina created a purplish hue to what would have usually been bright blue. The look in them seemed lost to Rex, as if they were decades older than their owner, or had just seen too much. Tovich stopped rocking abruptly. "I killed my brother. I murdered him," he said in a hoarse whisper. Rex adopted a sympathetic expression. "Brother, we've all lost family here. I understand your grief, but you can't blame yourself," he said with a calming influence. Tovich's face contorted with both regret and anger. "You don't understand. I was following orders." The coarse whisper bled through the cool air again. "He was my brother. I looked him in the eyes right before I pulled the trigger." Rex was confident the familial connotation was a reference to a brother in arms, but the unforgettable glare in his eyes betrayed something deeper. Not even the Empire would assign kin to the same outfit trooper. "Captain," the voice was Bren's, "the Empire didn't even know," she concluded with a sigh. "There is always contingency built into chain coding for exactly that purpose," Callus said. "We were stolen from our homes, huddled together in massive dropships, and dumped at the doorstep of training facilities. Coding wasn't even processed until we were through our first day." Conda interluded with a deceptively calm voice, taking a seat beside Bren. Callus began shaking his head. "Deplorable," he said louder than he would have liked. "They would have no way to segregate genetics." Bren laughed. "And why would they care to?" she said in an almost frantic cackle. Rex looked deep into Tovik's gaze. Desperation. He murmured, answering her rhetoric. Not desperate, strategic. Callus countered after a few long seconds. A show of force or superiority. However, it is a doomed tactic nonetheless, or one to suppose a certain influence upon those taken. Rex understood that Callus was trying to verbalize his active thoughts, conjoining his knowledge of Imperial protocols in the past with his bureau training. Whatever the case, its effects are sinister, he said, watching Tovik before him. The foggy glaze over the man's eyes faded for a moment, and he glanced down toward the blaster at Rex's hip. "Don't even think about it, son," Rex said, only loud enough for Tovich's ears. "None of us here want to hurt you, so don't give anyone a reason." Tovich's hand shot out for the blaster in defiance of the warning. Rex easily dodged the attempt, deflecting the incoming arm with his own, slipping in behind the trooper and placing a knee at the small of his back. Tovich took exception and began flailing his hands about him, trying to find purchase on Rex's forearms, his breathing and temperament taking an alarming turn. Rex countered by slipping his right arm around the man's neck and pulling back on his forehead. Callus placed himself between the foray and the other troopers, but neither was willing to get involved, a relief seeming to wash over both of their expressions. Rex held the position for 15 seconds, waiting for the man's arms to fall limply at his sides before releasing his arterial hold on his neck. "Just a blood choke. He'll be fine." "He is anything but fine," Conda spoke up. "He's lost his damn mind." Given the immediate circumstance, Rex couldn't agree more as he gently laid Tovik's head on the ground and placed his arms across his chest. "He has it, that trooper. I understand why we are here, and I'll make things easy for you by saying that I've been wanting to find a way to run since day one," Bren said with a sudden shift in direction. "Although I am hesitant to take up your cause, you've been gracious and kind to all three of us." She continued with a slight reversion to her native accent. Conda dropped himself to the ground at her side. "I couldn't have said that any better myself," joining her in removing the remainder of their armor, tossing the various pieces as far as they could physically throw them. Rex and Callus watched with a slight hint of pride in their gazes, understanding precisely what the two troopers were going through. The sound began as a whisper in the air as it reverberated from rock to rock, the sound of united voices crying out as one. Dust and scree from the stones above trickled down as the sounds became louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Small rocks pinged off the armor pieces as they lay motionless a few meters distant, the united song becoming louder and louder. Distinct voices overlapped in a single rallying call. "Oya, Oya," repeating with deeper resonance than voices should naturally carry. Rex moved toward Tovik, reaching down to grab the arms of the unconscious trooper and slinging him over his shoulder, the other three following as he made his way toward the center of the canyon. The echoes grew in their unnatural resonance, bringing larger stones down from the walls above, one rolling with tragic consequence as it thundered down and slammed the pile of armor in crunching devastation. All four felt the same instinctive urge to add their voices to the fray. Bren tapped Callus's shoulder. "You have an army here?" She almost shouted to be heard. He laughed, a genuine laugh from the deepest recesses of his chest. That is but 30 trooper." He smiled and began leading them out of the canyon, away from the source of the chanting. Exiting the canyon, they were assaulted by an endless view of lush prairie cascading over rolling hills. Rex, panting from the added weight, slowly dropped Tovik from his shoulders and laid him on the ground amid small but lush blades of deep green grass. "I thought she said this place was barren," he commented. "She said it used to be," Callus responded. "I am sure she was surprised at the changes too." The fading echoes of the chanting extinguished as they spread into the vast grasslands, leaving in their wake a more natural cadence of humming insects and aggressive bird calls. A warm breeze began exsanguinating the chill from their bones, starkly contrasting the frigid canyon walls behind them. "Where are we?" Bren asked, scanning in all directions, her dark eyes ever vigilant. Conda elicited a melancholy harumph. "Somewhere the Empire has already been." Rex and Callus turned to face him, questioning looks adorning each of them. "Ecologic botany was of interest on Toprawa. This is talic grass." He answered, "It is a side effect of the genetically modified grains the Empire uses for troop rations. Note the deep green pigmentation and the fact that it's growing in rock-hard soil," he continued, stomping his bare foot down for emphasis. "It's nature's way of reclaiming its own." A high-pitched whine began making its presence known, an audio assault disturbing the natural silence from behind them. The sound was aggravated by the echoing effect the rocky canyon walls imparted, and the unmistakable acceleration of the speeder bike seemed only seconds away. A thundering bass accented the whine as Miara's shuttle crested the craggy plateau above them, massive repulsors bending the grasses to their breaking point as it circled slowly before descending into the chaotic vegetation 50 meters distant. Moments later, the same shuttle that had delivered them to the canyon appeared, shockingly silent compared to the massive shuttle coming to rest on its pads, with violent quakes of hissing exhaust extolling from its heat vents, Bren observed. The smaller shuttle landed astride, the larger as the high-pitched whine finally shot out of the canyon. Two helmeted Mandalorians astride the 74Z and abruptly stopped at the foot of an opening cargo spillway on the larger shuttle. Finally, a Mandalorian fan sped over the congregation, but continued its trajectory before inclining and shooting itself out of eyesight. "This way," Callus instructed, leading them toward the large shuttle. Tovich came back around to consciousness, in time for Rex to adorn him with assistive support. As they came closer, both Conda and Bren noticed two anti-grav liters being offloaded through the spillway slowly, rank-and-file troops marching behind in solemn silence. Callus brought them short of the activity, falling in line with the petite Mandalorians and joined by the same Togruta that had talked to them earlier. Bren, in particular, noted the sincerity with which the assemblage was paying their respects to the dead. She knew the deceased wouldn't get the same treatment had they remained in Imperial hands, knowing they'd be evac'd through an airlock en masse, tossed unceremoniously into a pyre, or left to mingle with detritus and garbage, only to be incinerated later. She could only respond by shaking her head, a welling tear daring to race down her cheek. Bren looked to Conda, who returned the gaze, his eyes full of moisture. They both turned back to see the liters come to a complete stop, and each trooper following swung around to retrieve a collapsible shovel from their packs. A uniformed officer was the first to put the spade to the ground, Bren watching as the woman kicked the tool into the hard ground with enormous effort. Instinct took hold of her as she moved toward the uniformed woman, dropping to her knees a half-meter from her. Staring at the ground, Bren reached toward the woman with her hand open, her eyes focused on the hard-packed soil and clay. She felt the cool steel of the handle in her palm, grasped it with her other hand, and began to drive the spade into the ground. She felt each stab of protest in her muscles and bones as the point of the tool either glanced off stones or only chipped away small sections of the dense clay. Neither caring nor concerned over the futility of her actions, it gave her a chance to do something worth doing, at the very least. Bren glanced up to see that the uniformed woman had gone to retrieve another spade, then spun her gaze around in a wide arch to see that everyone else, including Conda, had taken tool to ground, even Tovich. The toil was arduous and painful, but each fallen Imperial would be granted the respect of individual resting places, something she knew they would never get had these rebels not taken the initiative. Rebels, she thought, as she scraped away at the final corner of the grave she was digging. The term felt derogatory since Trunian, as she rolled it in and out of thought. She momentarily turned toward the uniformed woman, a captain no less. She could only watch as the woman's muscles shook from the exhaustive efforts, yet how there was no hesitation within her to work side by side with a captive Imperial. Bren glanced around again, as everyone was working toward the same end. She knew Miriellen, Human, Togruta, Sulistan, Nikto, the list would have no end. Even a clone from a Republic fallen worked the ground next to her mind-rattled associate, watching as the balding man held Tovich steady, or preferred a canteen to the captive trooper's lips. "You're not a prisoner, you know." The captain snapped Bren out of her thoughts. She wanted to belt out the first thought that crossed her mind after her survey had levied serious considerations. "I know." But nothing was forthcoming. She hadn't even realized the impact that what was taking place all around her was having on her emotions, and she was firmly relishing her freedom to express them actively. Bren was afraid to open her mouth, lest she resort to a helpless mess at the feet of a rebel captain, or anyone. She focused on the captain again, noting the woman's dark complexion and how freely she wore her hair about her head. She pulled back her left sleeve and looked at her skin. Although moderately darker than the captain's, they were the same. "Where are you from?" Bren found herself asking. "Miara, and I'm from here," the captain responded. "Not originally, mind you, but it's the first home I remember." Bren thought her voice was passionate and kind, another stark difference she didn't need to remind herself of. They worked for a few moments in silence, removing stubborn rocks or kicking at small piles of loose dirt, both wordlessly expressing their interest in allowing the activity to consume them. "Bren Taldith, Halrun Kal, lived with my father and little sister on the outskirts of Pelik Bar," Bren said, her accent returning while mentioning her home. "I can braid it for you," she said after a few seconds. "What? Your hair? Miara? Captain. I can braid it for you. It has clearly been done before and would stay out of your face." Bren continued awkwardly, her accent returning in full force. "I had to do it for my sister all the time. She could never figure it out. Not well enough anyway." Miara was speechless for a long moment, thoughts of shame swimming through Bren's mind, wondering if she had stepped too far. Miara noted the abashed expression crossing the woman's dark face. "Sorry, Bren. It's just been a while. My sister still braids it whenever we see each other." Miara apologized for losing herself in her thoughts. "It's just that I haven't seen her in a while." She paused to keep herself ahead of her own emotions. "How long?" Bren asked. Miara hesitated, as she wasn't sure. "About 4 months now." She guessed, "How about you? When was the last time you saw your sister?" Bren cast her gaze toward the ground at her feet, trying in vain to focus on a small stone that had yet to yield to her spade. "She was killed 3 years ago." Miara drew a breath through her teeth, feeling shame over a question that should have felt natural. "My pa too. Tribal skirmish with the High Vale clans, I was told." Bren paused momentarily. "I tell myself that's what happened, only because the truth is too obvious." "Empire?" Miara asked, already knowing the answer. "What else?" Bren said with a deep exhale. "Then why serve?" Bren looked Miara dead in the eye, feeling her emotions on the precipice of betraying her again. "Because there was nothing left, Miara." She pulled herself out of the grave they had finished digging some time ago and stretched a hand down to assist the captain. "Before I knew there was another option." Her emotions began to run untamed down her cheeks as she cracked a slight smile. Miara accepted the assistance and came to stand next to the trooper as they surveyed their handiwork. "Don't!" They both turned hurriedly as they heard the scream some distance away, trying vainly to identify its source. The scene before them was a scramble of bodies, all converging on the location that Rex and Tovich had occupied. A sickening crunch was closely followed by a gurgling surge of liquefied air, snapping Miara and Bren out of their stasis. Rushing over, they saw everyone swiveling to the next, with hands over their mouths or clasped over their heads. Miara pushed a path through the congregation, Bren right behind her, to stop short of tripping over Rex, kneeling over the crumpled form of Tovik. Bren dropped to her knees at Tovik's feet and looked up toward his face, greeted only with a garish wound between his chin and neck that had already ceased gushing its lifeblood. "I only turned my head for a second," Rex said, still tightly grasping Tovik's hand with his own. Her heart laden, Bren watched as the aged clone gripped the hand one last time and closed Tovik's eyes with his free hand. Rex closed his own eyes and blew out a ragged breath. She felt for the clone. He had been the only one to express sincere concern over the troubled man. Without thinking, she pulled herself over to Rex and touched his shoulder. There isn't anything anyone could have done. This was inevitable. If not now, it would have been soon. She tried to console him. "Not like this trooper. I've seen it too many times, and I should have known better than to give him that spade." Rex responded, "No, you cannot blame yourself. He was lost to his mind the day he took a dagger to his flesh and carved out his name. The Empire caused this, not you." Bren spoke freely, her native accent blossoming fully with every syllable. Kawani stood at Ahsoka's side as they looked on, helpless to affect the situation. "Can we keep her?" Kawani asked in a light whisper, leaning closer to Ahsoka. "That is entirely up to her, and Miara," Ahsoka said in a returning whisper, Miara turning to face her as if on cue, giving her head a slight nod in the affirmative. "Entirely up to her, then." Ahsoka amended the statement. "Despite the atrocities we strive to overcome, some good always results from bad situations." Kawani spoke a little too loudly, as several of Naki's infiltrators turned to skewer the comment with their icy stares. She offered wordless apologies to all as she felt the heat of embarrassment flood her face. "Very wise words," Ahsoka whispered back to the Mirialan. "Next time, work on your delivery, though." She finished, clapping Kawani's back with an open palm. Kawani continued to watch, as both Bren and Rex lowered Tovik's body into the grave both the men had dug together, paying particular attention to Rex's body language and how fluid his motions were. She understood then that this was far from the first time he had buried a fellow soldier. The stocky man kept his emotions in tow, but she saw that the Force fed the man with a steady stream. She wondered if he felt any connection to those peaceful flows by way of his ever-present calm demeanor and resolve, she reasoned, but her inquiry had more to do with his spirit. Could he tell those flows were there? If so, was his response on an emotional level only? She would have to ask him. Naki directed the internment as each deceased Imperial was properly rested in their respective graves. The tremendous effort took hours, but each was now adequately covered. There was no ornamentation, kind words, or heartfelt speeches, only the cold silence of duty and sacrifice. Naki hadn't known which of the dead had instigated the carnage aboard the Tangible, and didn't proceed with trying to find out. What mattered was now taken care of, and the souls of the dead could find whatever peace or rest their respective hosts believed in. He had instructed his men to return the liters, the tools, and themselves to the shuttle, and was standing at his captain's side, overlooking the dead. The casualties mount Sebastian. In the end, it won't matter what side someone is on, only the silence of what was, she said quietly as she folded her arms across her chest. "Ma'am, serving at your side is truly an honor," Naki responded. Catching her momentarily off guard, she turned to face him, although she was unsure she had any words to convey. "What you've done today, Captain." "Miara," she stated, cutting him off. "What you've done today, Miara, means a lot to everyone. You show compassion to your enemy and carry yourself with the same respect and honor you show all of us. It is an honor, Captain, Miara, truly," he said with all sincerity. "The honor is mine as well, Sebastian. You display those same qualities in everything you do, and you've saved my ass on more than one occasion." She returned with a smile, creasing her full lips. He turned to look at her thoroughly, gave her a return smile, and stood motionless for a moment, his mouth bobbing for words he wanted desperately to say, yet never would. "It is my duty, ma'am," he said with his usual business-first approach. "Orders, ma'am?" he asked as his frame turned rigid, standing at attention. She wasn't particularly sure what he had warred with himself over saying, but she was sure his comment was not it. "Return to the shuttle and prepare for departure. We will rendezvous with the purveyor presently. I will be with you shortly." "Very good, ma'am," he responded with a dutiful salute and turned his muscular frame about. She watched him until he was well within the confines of the shuttle. Footsteps approaching behind her caused her to flush with embarrassment. Turning, she saw Ahsoka attempting to hide a smile. "What?" Miara said. Ahsoka elicited a soft giggle. "Oh, nothing." She let her words trail off as she clasped Miara's shoulder and spun her toward the visage of the settlement where they had met so many years ago, a mere speck on the horizon. "I wonder if that lock still works," she said, clasping Miara's shoulder tight before patting her back and walking away. Miara stood alone, staring toward the village she had grown up in. It was a village with no name because it didn't need one. She was sure her old home was still there, occupied by someone very desperately wanting not to be found. She had yet to understand why Alderaan had felt more like her home as she glanced down toward the graves at her feet, knowing full well the graves of her parents weren't more than a few kilometers distant. She didn't want to think about this moon anymore, and could only watch as tiny lights sprang to life amidst the approaching dark of Rada's night.